The first thing Yara Kell did when the hull alarm triggered was not panic. She was 22 years old and alone on a survey skiff the size of a cargo container, 3 days out from the Vel-Sera drift lane, when the portside stabilizer housing cracked and vented half the drive coolant into space. The alarm was a flat, two-tone pulse. She silenced it in 4 seconds, pulled up the diagnostic panel with her left hand, while her right was already reaching for the patch kit mounted above the bunk, and began reading numbers. The numbers were bad. Not catastrophically bad, not yet, but bad enough that a Korrathi survey tech or a Korrathi navigator would already be composing a distress packet. The coolant loss was 16% and climbing. The secondary drive was drawing on reserve cells that had not been rated for primary load. And the comm relay, a single-band Korrathi transmitter bolted to the outer hull, had taken a micrometeorite hit sometime in the last 6 hours silently, and was now broadcasting nothing. Yara noted all 3 facts, set the patch kit on the console beside her, and went to make tea. It was not indifference, it was sequencing. She had learned at 11 that the first thing panic did was eat your decision time, and decision time was the only resource that mattered when things broke. Her father had told her that in a machine shed on a farm on a world that had tried on multiple occasions to kill them both. She had believed him then. She believed him now. The tea was a plain pressed leaf pack from a supply crate labeled in Korrathi trade script. She did not read Korrathi trade script, but she had learned that the silver foil packs were caffeinated and the green foil ones were not, and she reached for silver without looking. While it steeped, she mapped the repair order. The comm relay was the most urgent and the least fixable from inside the hull. She would need to do an exterior walk, which meant suiting up, which meant the interior temperature would need to hold above the suit's operating minimum for the duration. The stabilizer housing crack was the second priority. Seal it, stop the coolant bleed, get the drive thermal margin back above the red line. The reserve cell draw was third, because once the other 2 were addressed it would self-correct, and if they were not addressed it would not matter anyway. She wrote the sequence on the inside of her wrist with a grease pencil. Then she drank the tea, suited up and went outside. The Vel-Sera drift lane was named for the Vel-Sera survey company that had first charted it, and it was not, by most standards, a dangerous corridor. The debris field that ran along its northern edge had been mapped to a resolution of 40 meters. The background radiation was within tolerable limits for most known species. Traffic was sparse but present. A patrol loop ran along the outer edge every 72 hours, and there was a relay station 3 days hard burn to spinward. None of that was immediately useful to Yara. What was immediately useful was that the skiff's exterior service rail ran the full length of the portside hull, giving her handholds all the way from the airlock to the comm housing. She moved along it without rushing, the stars wheeling slowly past, the drive housing a dull orange smear of heat behind her. The comm relay was worse up close. The micrometeorite had punched through the transmitter board at the worst possible angle, clipping the oscillator housing and shearing 2 of the 4 mounting bolts. The unit was not salvageable in any conventional sense, but Yara had grown up on a farm that ran 12 kilometers from the nearest parts supplier, and she had an opinion about the word salvageable that most engineers would not share. She spent 40 minutes on the exterior with a cold-weld kit, a length of conductive braid stripped from a secondary sensor lead, and a manual frequency key she had never expected to use. What she rebuilt was not a transmitter. It was, more accurately, a directed noise generator on the emergency distress band, a single repeating pulse, non-coded, the kind of signal that registered on any receiver as hardware malfunction rather than deliberate transmission. It was the best she could do. She went back inside. The stabilizer housing took 3 hours. The crack ran 12 centimeters along the lower seam, and the patch compound needed 2 heat cycles to cure properly in the skiff's reduced temperature environment. Between cycles, Yara ate a cold ration from the supply crate, checked the reserve cell draw, and slept for 40 minutes with her hand on the drive monitor. She had learned to sleep in intervals on the harvest runs. Her father had run the combine through the night during the short seasons, and she had grown up rotating the watch in 4-hour blocks, long enough to rest, short enough that nothing had time to go wrong without someone awake to catch it. The skill had seemed unremarkable at the time. It seemed less unremarkable now. When the second heat cycle finished, she tested the patch, found it holding, bled the coolant line back to the reservoir, and watched the drive thermal margin climb out of the red. The reserve cells stabilized within the hour. She wrote the time on her wrist beside the repair sequence, both lines crossed off. The comm relay was still broadcasting its meaningless distress pulse. She could not know whether it was reaching anyone. She did not know whether the signal degradation from the damaged oscillator was keeping it below detection threshold. She did not know whether the patrol loop had been suspended, or whether the relay station 3 days out was even staffed. She knew how to sail a broken skiff on reserve cells across 3 days of empty drift lane. She did that instead. Fleet Commander Ovreth of the Korrathi 7th Survey Group had 31 years of deep field experience, and she had encountered hardware distress pulses exactly twice before. Both times the vessel had been dead on arrival, one a Korrathi probe that had clipped a rogue mass and tumbled, one a Korrathi cargo skiff whose pilot had succumbed to a slow atmospheric leak before the signal was detected. In both cases, the debris had been colder than ambient, and the recovery had been procedural. She had filed the reports without particular emotion. The signal currently on her board was different. It was weaker than standard, degraded, oscillating in a way that suggested damage to the transmitter itself rather than clean hardware failure, and it had been pulsing on the emergency distress band for 19 days before one of her sensor techs had flagged it as anomalous. Not a probe, not a Korrathi freighter. Registry trace came back as a Vel-Sera survey skiff, single occupancy, departed the Vel-Sera approach station 22 days prior. Single occupancy. Ovreth species was not easily alarmed. Korrathi were long-lived, slow to surprise, possessed of a metabolic calm that most other species read as coldness. She had been told on several occasions that she was unreadable. She chose to regard this as a compliment. She was at this moment slightly alarmed. She ordered the intercept burn at 1.3 standard gravities and stood at the forward scope for the 4 hours it took to reach the skiff's position. What the scope showed her when they were close enough was not wreckage. The skiff was dark, running on reserve cells, which explained the weak signal, but it was oriented correctly, drives pointing anti-spinward, hull intact. There was a repair scar on the portside stabilizer housing, visible as a faint discoloration under the scan. There was a cold-weld patch on the comm housing that had not been there in the departure registry photos. The airlock telemetry was showing green. Ovreth stood very still for a moment. Then she opened the hailing channel. Survey Skiff Vel-Sera 7, this is Fleet Commander Ovreth of the Korrathi 7th Survey Group. Please respond. 19 seconds passed, then. This is Vel-Sera 7, go ahead. The voice was young and even. Not exhausted, not trembling, not the voice of someone who had spent 19 days adrift without communications in a damaged vessel. It was the voice of someone who had perhaps been interrupted from something routine. Ovreth chose her next words carefully. We are reading a distress signal from your position. Can you confirm your status? A short pause, shorter than the transmission lag warranted, which meant the occupant had been thinking while the signal traveled. Drives are on reserve cells, should have enough to make the relay station on current burn. Comms were damaged. I put up a noise pulse on the emergency band as a flag. Did it reach you? It reached us. Good, another pause. I've been running on reserve for 11 days. I was planning to hail from the relay station, once I was in range. Ovreth looked at her scan tech, who looked back at her. The scan tech was young Korrathi, barely 30, on her second deep field rotation, and her expression was one that Ovreth recognized, because she had worn it herself the first time she had reviewed the census data on Earth's surface conditions. It was the expression of someone recalculating. "We will escort you to the relay station," Ovreth said. "Stand by for docking approach." "Understood. I should mention the portside stabilizer patch is solid, but I haven't load tested it above 0.8 drives. I'd recommend staying below that." "Noted." Ovreth closed the channel. She stood at the forward scope for a moment longer, looking at the dark skiff with its cold-weld scars and its running reserve cells, drifting with perfect orientation in the middle of the Vel-Sera drift lane. The repair scar on the stabilizer housing was small and exact. The comm patch was improvised, but it had worked 19 days of signal, enough for her sensor tech to flag it, enough to bring her here. She thought about what it meant to be alone in a vessel that size, in a drift lane this sparse, with a cracked hull and dead comms and reserve cells running down, for 19 days. Then she thought about the occupant's voice on the channel, the way it had not been the voice of someone describing a crisis, but the voice of someone describing a set of solved problems. She pulled up the census record for Earth, Class 12 biosphere, atmospheric toxicity in the upper range, 3 major predator categories in the higher mass brackets, extreme temperature variance across inhabited zones. The survey note at the bottom of the record, added by a Korrathi xenologist 40 years ago, read: "Inhabitants demonstrate anomalous stress response suppression under acute survival conditions. Mechanism unknown. Further study recommended." The Korrathi xenologist had not, apparently, found a mechanism. Neither had anyone else. Ovreth suspected they were looking for the wrong thing. A mechanism implied something added, a biochemical override, a hormonal suppression, a trained response kicking in. What she had just watched did not look like suppression. It looked like the opposite of suppression. It looked like a person for whom 19 days alone in a broken vessel, running quiet repairs and sleeping in intervals, and building a noise generator out of stripped sensor wire, was simply the order in which the problems needed solving. Not endurance, something quieter than endurance, the absence of the thing that made endurance necessary. She filed the recovery report. In the field for occupant condition she typed, nominal asterisk. Then she thought about it and added, occupant reports stabilizer patch solid, recommends drive sealing at 0.8 pending load test. That seemed like the right note to end on. Yara Kell docked at the Vel-Sera relay station 4 hours later, filed her equipment damage report with the Vel-Sera desk, requested a replacement transmitter board, and ate a full meal for the first time in 11 days, a bowl of something the station cafeteria called a grain stew, which tasted more like pressed chalk than grain, but was hot. The Korrathi fleet commander found her there. Tall, gray-plated, with the quiet bearing of someone who had been watching things for a very long time, and the eyes of someone currently rereading something she thought she understood. "Your repair log," Ovreth said, setting a data slate on the table. "The relay desk pulled it from your skiff's internal recorder. I hope you don't mind. It was part of the standard recovery check." Yara looked at the slate. The log was thorough. She had kept it force of habit, the same way her father had kept a maintenance log on every piece of equipment they owned, because you could not fix what you did not document. "I don't mind," she said. Ovreth sat down across from her, which was not something Yara had expected. The fleet commander folded her hands on the table in a way that suggested she was organizing something internally. "The noise generator," Ovreth said. "How did you know the frequency band?" "The emergency distress band is printed on the inside of the transmitter housing," Yara said. "Standard Vel-Sera skiff. It's there in case you need to key it manually. And the cold-weld on the oscillator mount." The mounting bolts were sheared. I needed to hold the rebuilt unit in place. Cold-weld was what I had. Ovreth was quiet for a moment. Most pilots in your situation, she said, would have sealed the airlock and waited. Yara considered this. That was an option, she said, but the reserve cells had 11 days of draw at idle. The relay station was 12 to 14 days out on current trajectory, depending on debris routing. It was closer than waiting. Ovreth nodded slowly, as though she were recording something. Yara finished the grain stew. It still tasted like pressed chalk. She ate all of it. Outside the station viewport, the Vel-Sera drift lane ran on in both directions. A thin corridor of mapped space between the debris fields, ordinary and quiet and very empty. The kind of place where things could go wrong in complete silence and nobody would know. It was the kind of place, Yara thought, that just needed a good repair sequence. She put her spoon down, thanked the fleet commander for the escort, and went to find out when the next supply run back to the approach station was departing.